James Marshall, a seasoned royal guard, stood at attention. The sweltering summer heat pressed against his uniform, beads of sweat forming under his bearskin hat. He had been through countless shifts, faced off with unruly tourists, and held his composure even when children tried to make him laugh. He knew the rules: no movement, no emotion, no reaction. Yet something in the air felt off. A lone figure in the crowd caught his eye. An elderly man stood at the front, his frail hands trembling as he clutched a worn-out military cap. His eyes, blue, sharp, and filled with something deep, never wavered. He stood there, still just like the guards. James knew that look. It was respect, it was honor, and it was pain. Then the old man did something unexpected. He raised a shaking hand to his forehead and gave a slow, deliberate salute. James's heart clenched. He knew he should ignore it. He knew he should keep his posture, his discipline, his training. But something about this moment, about this man, tugged at something buried deep inside him. Would he break the rules? Would he risk it all? His mind fought against his instincts. Years of discipline screamed at him to stand still. The Royal Guard tradition was older than any of them, built on unwavering control. Yet something about this man, his frailty, his silent demand for acknowledgement, made James's chest tighten. He could feel the eyes of his fellow guards, but more importantly, the scrutiny of the crowd. Thousands of people stood watching, waiting for their perfect moment to capture. His hesitation, even a blink too long, would be analysed, debated, and spread across the internet within minutes. James inhaled sharply. The weight of history pressed down on his shoulders. What if he was making a mistake? James's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. The heat, the tourists, the cameras, none of it existed anymore. All that remained was the old man's salute, hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. He wasn't just some random visitor. His uniform, though aged, bore faint insignias from decades past. His rigid stance wasn't that of an ordinary civilian. No, this man had served. He had stood where James stood now, and he was waiting for something. James swallowed hard. The rules of the Royal Guard were clear. Show no emotion. Engage with no one. But this wasn't a laughing child or a disrespectful tourist. This was a soldier, a brother in arms. James clenched his jaw. He couldn't move, he shouldn't, but deep inside, something told him that the right choice wasn't always the one written in the rule book. Then, so subtly that most wouldn't notice, he made his decision. He lifted his hand. The motion was small, precise. Not enough to draw attention, but enough for the old man to see. A single salute. A silent acknowledgement. And then something happened that no one expected. The old man's lip quivered. His salute wavered, and then slowly he lowered his hand, his eyes glistening. The connection was brief, but undeniable. Then the crowd erupted. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, some murmuring in hushed voices. James knew it was done. The cameras had caught it, and there was no going back now. His pulse pounded as he heard the faint clicking of shutters and the beeping of phones capturing the moment from every possible angle. The old man stood there for a moment longer, his face unreadable, then gave a nod before stepping back into the crowd. James felt a strange tightness in his throat, something unfamiliar, something dangerous. Had he just thrown away everything for one salute? His training dictated absolute discipline, but his gut told him that some moments mattered more than rules. Would his superiors see it that way? James stood rigid as the crowd's cheers and gasps faded into a dull roar in the background. He could feel his fellow guards tense beside him, their discipline shaken by his brief but powerful acknowledgement. The moment had lasted only a second, but its weight was immeasurable. Then the inevitable happened. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. A senior officer approached from inside the palace gates. Commander Ellis, a man known for his strict adherence to tradition, stopped inches from James, his face unreadable beneath his cap. The crowd, still buzzing, was unaware of the storm brewing within the ranks. "Inside! Now!" James swallowed hard, breaking his stance just enough to follow orders. As he marched through the towering palace doors, he knew one thing for certain: there would be consequences. James stood at attention in the commander's office, the walls lined with medals, portraits of past leaders, and framed documents detailing the sacred traditions of the Royal Guard. Commander Ellis paced behind his desk, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Finally he spoke. "Do you understand what you've done?" James didn't flinch. "Yes, sir." The commander let out a slow breath. "Then explain to me why." James hesitated. The words were simple in his head, but voicing them felt dangerous. Finally he met the commander's gaze. "That man was a veteran, sir. He deserved acknowledgement." Ellis's expression didn't change. "You broke centuries of discipline." James clenched his jaw. "And I'd do it again." A charged silence filled the room. Then, to James's surprise, Ellis sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You're not the first to think like that, Marshal, but times are changing." James blinked, confused. Was he not about to be discharged? Ellis studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You're on report, but you won't be dismissed." Relief washed over James. He nodded, accepting the consequences, but deep down he felt something else. Hope. Within hours, the footage of James's silent salute had been shared across social media, news outlets picking it up with headlines like "A Guard's Respectful Defiance" and "A Tradition Broken for Honour." James, however, had no interest in the fame. But the next morning, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the palace, addressed specifically to James. It was from the old man. With slightly trembling hands, James opened it, scanning the carefully penned words. As he read, his breath caught in his throat. The man had served in the same regiment as James's late grandfather. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes. The old soldier hadn't just been saluting a guard. He had been saluting the grandson of his fallen comrade. James clutched the letter tightly. This wasn't just about discipline or tradition anymore. This was personal. Determined to know more, James began researching the veteran. He requested access to archived military records and, with the help of an old family album, pieced together a connection he never knew existed. The old man, Arthur Whitman, had served alongside his grandfather in a crucial battle decades ago. The letter detailed how Arthur had owed his life to James's grandfather, who had saved him during an ambush. James sat in silence, staring at the letter. The weight of history pressed on his chest. This moment wasn't just about tradition. It was about honouring something much deeper. James sat alone, staring at the letter. The weight of its contents pressed on his chest. His actions had sparked debate, but more importantly, they had connected him to something bigger than himself. He knew what he had to do. The next day, in full uniform, he left the palace grounds on special leave. Destination. The old man's address. When he arrived at the modest house, he found the veteran waiting on the porch, his hands resting on his cane. Their eyes met. No words were needed. James saluted first this time. The old man returned it, his weathered face breaking into a smile. What followed was hours of stories, of his grandfather, of war, of duty, and of honour. James listened, absorbing every word, knowing he was exactly where he needed to be. As they sat in the fading afternoon light, Arthur reached into a small box beside him and pulled out a medal. It was an old, worn military honour, one James recognised from his grandfather's stories. Arthur pressed it into James's hand. "Your grandfather saved my life, lad. He was a hero, and now you carry that same spirit." James swallowed hard, emotion thick in his throat. He had always wanted to make his family proud, but he never imagined this was the way it would happen. He left that evening, with something new in his heart: purpose. The next changing of the guard was different. James stood in formation once again, but this time something had shifted. His heart was lighter, his purpose clearer. The ceremony began as usual: precision, discipline, silence. But as they moved into position, James caught sight of the crowd, and there, standing among the spectators, was the old man. James didn't break character. He didn't move out of place. But as his path took him past the veteran, his fingers twitched, ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement. The old man smiled, and for the first time James knew. Some traditions aren't about rules, they're about respect. In the days that followed, more stories began to surface. Other guards who had broken small rules to honour veterans, silent gestures exchanged between soldiers across generations. The palace administration, rather than punishing James further, took note. Weeks later, James received an official summons. To his surprise, it wasn't a reprimand, it was an invitation. The Royal Guard was considering a new policy, one that allowed for small, meaningful acknowledgements of veterans. James's action had set something in motion greater than he had imagined. At the next ceremony, a new face stood among the tourists, a young cadet barely out of training. James saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the same hesitancy he had felt once. And when the moment came, James gave him the smallest nod of approval. The next time a veteran saluted, James knew he wouldn't be the only one to respond. A new tradition had begun. In the weeks following James's silent salute, the discussions surrounding the role of the Royal Guard in honouring veterans intensified. News outlets continued to cover the story, and the public response was overwhelmingly supportive. Veterans groups began advocating for official recognition of their sacrifices in ceremonial traditions. At the palace, discussions were happening behind closed doors. James had been called in several times for meetings, not for disciplinary action, but for consultation. His once unintentional act of respect had now become the catalyst for a movement. One afternoon, James received an unexpected invitation from Commander Ellis. When he entered the commander's office, he was surprised to find a small group of high-ranking officials waiting for him. Ellis gestured for him to sit. "Marshal, you've started something we can't ignore," Ellis began. "We're drafting a proposal for a new tradition within the changing of the guard. We'd like your input." James's breath caught. "Sir?" The commander leaned forward. "We're considering a formal moment of recognition. Something subtle but significant. A nod, a minor salute, some form of acknowledgement for veterans attending the ceremony." James nodded slowly, his heart pounding. "That would mean a great deal to them, sir." Ellis studied him for a moment. "You'd be the face of this change, Marshal. Are you ready for that responsibility?" James straightened his back. "Yes, sir." It was an overcast morning, and James stood in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, waiting for the ceremony to begin. The crowd was larger than usual, a mixture of tourists and veterans who had come to witness the introduction of the new tradition. This time, James wasn't just another soldier in formation. He was part of something bigger, a new chapter in history. The changing of the guard commenced as usual, but as James and his unit moved into position, a subtle but powerful moment unfolded. Among the crowd, a row of veterans stood at attention, their medals gleaming in the muted sunlight. As James marched past them, he executed the gesture that had been agreed upon, a small but deliberate tilt of the head. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't grand, but it meant everything. The veterans acknowledged the gesture with nods of their own, some even saluting back. It was a silent but profound exchange of respect, one that had never been a part of the tradition before, but now it was there to stay. As the ceremony concluded, James felt a weight lift from his chest. He had done what needed to be done. After the event, as he prepared to return to his post, a familiar voice stopped him. "Well done, lad. James turned to see Arthur Whitman, standing near the gates, a proud smile on his weathered face. He saluted James one last time, and this time James didn't hesitate to return it. As the sun broke through the clouds above Buckingham Palace, James knew that he had done more than just change a rule. He had honoured a legacy.